Welcome to a new episode of Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer, and today our topic is going to be adventures in DNA. How does it change our history? I have been a genealogist for more than 40 years and worked very, very hard to assemble documentation on my family. I was a little bit reluctant to jump on board the bandwagon with the DNA craze because that's what it has been. There's been nothing that has affected and impacted the genealogical world like DNA. So what is it that DNA can do for us that adds to traditional research methods? It's another tool, and one that I have found has vastly opened my horizons. I also like solving puzzles. So one of the key things for me is I had a sense through building one person at a time in my ancestry of who these various people were that connected to me. But one of the things about the paper trail in genealogy is that it really depends on where our ancestors lived and how records were recorded. So as someone that has DNA from two very, very different societies, on my mother's side of the family, largely English, for the most part of people who have been in the United States for several centuries, I have a great deal of paper evidence. But from my father's side of the family, grandson of Irish immigrants, it's much harder to piece his puzzle together. So gradually, through the use of DNA evidence and mapping various families, I have been able to connect and go back much further on my father's side of the family than the paper trail would have allowed me to do. Some 26 million Americans have had their DNA tested. The number of people who have submitted DNA tests has doubled from 2018 to 2019. The verdict is still out on this year as to how many people during COVID isolation would be inclined to have their DNA tested. Of course, the more people that join in with having their DNA uploaded to various companies, there are a lot of other issues that will ensue. I'll be talking about some of them. But the first part of our journey today is going to talk about the aspect of DNA research that probably is the source of the most conversation, and that is ethnicity estimates. How many of you have heard something that goes like this? I got a DNA kit for Christmas, and now I know that I'm 10% Icelandic and 15% Finnish. This is a surprise to me. Well, you may not be. And let me give you some examples of ethnicity estimates that can be slightly skewed because it's not based so much on DNA per se, but it's based on algorithms and estimates. In the middle of this slide, I have a young boy sitting on the porch with his grandmother. This is Vermonter George Valley. He was one of the first people for whom I did a DNA study because I thought it would be an absolute sure thing. In this slide of George and his grandmother, I wasn't there, but I know that they were not speaking English. George didn't speak English until he went to school, and half-day English, half-day French. Winooski at that time in the 50s was a very strong French enclave. All George's grandparents were born in Canada. On the left, we have Alfred Valley and Catherine Blais, who were married in Montreal in 1903, and his other grandparents on the right, Gustave Lavallée and Eugenie Valley, who were married in another Quebec town in 1906. So when George's ethnicity results came back, I fully expected him to register as 100% French. You can imagine my surprise when I saw these results, that there was nothing French here. And the part that was truly a mystery to me is how could George be 17% Iberian and 18% Italian and Greek and a little bit of Irish? So it was one of those things, even though I had evidence here that he was not French, I just didn't believe it. I felt something was skewed with this ethnicity estimate. So over time, and this is something that many people have become familiar with, how does your DNA change? Your DNA doesn't change, but how it is interpreted does. And here is how George's ethnicity estimates evolved with time. By October of 2019, several years after his first ethnicity test, George came back as 100% French, which I knew all along because all of his ancestors, his grandparents and backward, were born in Canada. That came as no surprise. So I felt that George's ethnicity was vindicated. But here is what happened. Yet again, George's ethnicity was revised, and in the latest estimate, early in this year, George was changed to 85% French and 15% England, Wales, Northwestern Europe. So what we have to realize here is that the ethnicity is determined by the people who have become part of the test groups. And sometimes this varies from company to company. So let me give you another example here of how this can vary within one family. At the time of George's first test result, when I saw how different his ethnicity was compared to what I anticipated, I asked his sister to have her DNA tested. George's sister JoAnne came back with the same results as him. When the results were revised for George's sister JoAnne, she came back also as 100% French, but here's where it gets a little crazy. Because in the second revision of JoAnne's DNA, taken last fall, she went down to 70% French. So how is it then that two people in the same family, full siblings, one can be 85% French and the other can be 70% French? And just to add to the complexity of all of this, I asked the second sister in the family, Sue, if she were willing to have her DNA analyzed. Sue, a year apart from Joe, same parents, came back as 61% French. So again, I'm pointing these examples out to you because you can't rely on one single test alone to determine ethnicity. Here is one of my early estimates of AncestryDNA, and I fully expected this because my father, as I mentioned earlier, is the grandson of Irish immigrants. Many of my mother's people ultimately have roots in Great Britain. Scandinavia, Finland, Northwest Russia is something that is a mystery to me. In my revision of AncestryDNA, we see that it looks like I have specific regions of Ireland identified here. The reason that these regions of Ireland are identified is that this is a combination of paper research and how people have identified where their ancestors came from. I have been able to use my mother's DNA here, which again gives me a much closer capturing of her family. And if you notice with mom's DNA, she has some slightly different ethnic predictions here, with both Norway 4% and Portugal for 1%. And one of the things I need to explain right now is that One's paper lineage, how we map out our ancestors on paper, does not equate to the percentage of DNA we get from them. So let me explain using a simplified version of my mother's tree. So my mother appears here as Marilyn Morse. Her father is Emery Morse, who is not here because I'm looking at her mother's side of the family. My grandmother is Lois. Her parents are John Rhodes. Her mother is Marion Sylvia. So what I am trying to illustrate here is that one would expect that one would get 50% DNA from each parent, 25% from each grandparent, and so on. So when we look at mother's great-grandfather, Marion Sylvia, he was from the Azores, so I would have anticipated that mom somehow would have inherited 12.5% Portuguese DNA. But that isn't how patterns of inheritance work, because over time what happens is that one can have genes passed on, one can have fewer patterns of DNA passed on to descendants. The more that we go back, we go forward in time, the more complicated it can become. And here's how all of this works. Marion Sylvia here is one of my true DNA mysteries. He is my mother's great-grandfather who was born in the Azores, I think. We have no birth record for him, no names of parents. We know that by the time he was 19 years old, he was in Cape Cod on a whaling boat. I am hoping that eventually, with no paper evidence for this man, that I will be able to get some clues as to who his parents are. He certainly had parents. Did he have siblings? Did he have first cousins? One day, I hope to be able to map out his family. So if he is my mother's great-grandfather, there should be something in my mother's DNA that reflects a pattern of ethnicity from the Azores. So in mom's first ancestry estimate here, we see England and Ireland and Germanic Europe as her ancestry became revised. Now, moving to different companies here, let's look at how different databases and different people contributing can determine how ancestry would be presented differently. So the first of the commercial DNA companies, 23andMe, obviously has a different database of contributors. In my first analysis of my ethnicity with 23andMe, I came out largely British and Irish. Here is French and German, and 1.6% Spanish and Portuguese. I fully expected that. With my mother, we can see that the amount of Spanish and Portuguese that my mother has through that great-grandfather is approximately double what I had on mine. And yet with other companies, they might not pick up on the ancestor that came from the Azores. One of the databases that is very much in the news of late is something called GEDmatch. There is a new television show called The Genetic Detective, and in The Genetic Detective, the person who is one of the leading voices of DNA matching is C.C. Moore. C.C. Moore uses data to track down criminals. So in GEDmatch, it is a platform by which, when your DNA has been analyzed from other companies, you may choose to upload it to GEDmatch. This is a platform for very serious genealogists. So here is one example where you can see My mother's kit has been uploaded, and I have juxtaposed it to the kit of someone else. And here we start to see with whom these two people share DNA. Now, this also underscores one of the controversies of DNA and privacy. Some companies have sold or made public to other people DNA matches. GEDmatch asked its contributors if they would allow this DNA to be used for law enforcement purposes. This is how we find cold case mysteries eventually solved. People have the right here to opt in or opt out. I chose to allow my DNA matches to be used to track criminals because although we do have some past criminals in my family, there are none at present, to the best of my knowledge. Another company is MyHeritage DNA. And this one is very different, as you can see, because my DNA with this company has me as 88% Irish and 11% Scandinavian. So where does the 11% Scandinavian come from? I think this is a reflection of the fact of how Irish or English DNA may ultimately trace back to Viking ancestors. And as you can see, from company to company, the ethnicity estimates are very different. My mom's estimate with the same company, by comparison, shows that mom is largely from Northern Europe, but she seems to have 1.2% of Ashkenazi Jewish. And how does that fit in? Well, since I believe mom's great-grandfather, the sailor from the Azores, if we trace back families who moved to the Azores in the 15th century, many of them were Jews that were driven out of the Iberian Peninsula during the time of Ferdinand and Isabella. So here in this test, perhaps that is where the Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry came from with my mother. 23andMe also was the first company to offer you medical analyses. And a lot of this is determined by not only an analysis of your DNA, but also for various questions that you have. And this is one of the many bad diseases that I'm fortunate not to have. So the larger question with DNA for health is that if someone is concerned about the inheritance pattern of a certain disease, familial pattern, you probably don't want to rely on a kit that is on sale from a commercial company without looking for some sounder medical advice. Let's talk now about specific DNA analyses. Family tree DNA allows for the analysis of mitochondrial DNA. So mitochondrial DNA is passed down exclusively from mother to child. So with my mother's DNA sample, we were able to analyze all the people that share my mother's mitochondrial line. And of the people that have a genetic distance of 0, which means that there is no deviation from the common ancestor, much to my surprise, the two people that showed a genetic distance of 0 with my mother were both people whose earliest known ancestor was in Norway. I'm fortunate enough with the paper trail of my mother's ancestry that I was able to trace her earliest female ancestor back to a woman named Jane Duren or Durrell, who married in Salem, Massachusetts in 1667. So how does that correlate here with two people whose earliest known ancestors were in Norway in the 18th century? That is a mystery that I will continue to work on because I haven't quite figured it out yet. Another example of how DNA can help us solve mysteries. My grandfather, Michael Dwyer, after whom I am named, was named in turn after his grandfather, Michael Dwyer of the hamlet of Dreen Olive near Sneem, Kerry, Ireland on the Ring of Kerry. Here is a man for whom I have no birth record, no death record, scant record of property. One of the few pieces of paper evidence that I have for him is that this extract from Parish Register in 1857, where Michael Dwyer, spelled it a little differently from my name, married Mary Mahoney of the neighboring village. I have no idea who Michael's parents are, who his siblings are. So this is where I am hoping that DNA may give me some answers, not only to identify ultimately Michael Dwyer's father, but who his siblings were, who his cousins were. When I submitted my DNA to Family Tree DNA, which also analyzes Y DNA, that is the DNA that is passed exclusively from father to son, it was a bit of a disappointment because there were only a couple of Dwyers with whom I shared DNA, and none of these people have written back to me to confirm any shared ancestry. So what does this mean? Does this mean that I come from a rare genetic line? No, all this means is that since this is a specialized test that analyzes Y DNA, there have been very few people that match with me who have submitted this particular test. Every now and again, this company emails me and says, you have new genetic matches. So even though this has not been a particularly useful tool for me to identify ancestors in my Y DNA line, one day, as other people choose to have this test done, we may get an answer. For most people who are looking to make family connections through DNA, they look to autosomal DNA. So autosomal DNA is what we inherit from each parent. And over time, the measurement that we use of autosomal DNA are centimorgans, which are abbreviated CM. So when we look at AncestryDNA results for me, for my autosomal DNA, we can see that there is my mother, that we share over 3,400 centimorgans of autosomal DNA, as one would expect. So over time, there are various charts that tell us the amount of autosomal DNA that we can expect to share with people with whom we share DNA. And of course, by the time it gets down to fourth cousins, fifth cousins, that amount of DNA gets rather negligible. So here, I am fortunate to have a number of people in my extended family who have contributed their DNA samples. So my father's second cousin is here. His DNA name is RIRE87, and you can see he has 468 centimorgans of DNA that he shares with me. And this is a useful benchmark for me to determine relationships that exclusively occur through my father's family. SH is my mother's first cousin. So once again, having SH here as a marker allows me to separate people that are only related to me on my mother's side of the family. And again, having my mother's specific DNA brings me a generation closer to people who share genetic relationships with me. And it's interesting here, when we get out to 4 or 5 generations distant, sometimes the amount of autosomal DNA runs out by the time that we get to the 4th or 5th generation. So what that means is that people who show up as related to my mother may not be related to me, because the amount of autosomal DNA disappears by the time it gets down to me. You can't always believe suggestions. So for example, on AncestryDNA, there is a shared ancestor hint here that is based on other people's paper evidence, and this proved to be one that is not correct. And sometimes the DNA to justify this was aligned through the wrong cousin. We've all heard stories of surprises. So here is Wilfred, my grandmother's cousin, who was a World War II veteran. He was a bachelor, and in his last days he said to me, "You're a history teacher. Do you want all my World War II memorabilia?" I said yes. He said, "Well, I want it to go to someone in the family, and since I have no children, it's all yours." Well, the big surprise is that Wilfred did have a child. And this person contacted me, and it was a bit of a shock when his DNA matched mine, and the only way that that could have come was through Wilfred, whom he knew as a family friend. And it left him quite upset, because of course there are so many things about this that can't be answered. Everyone, I think, has heard of stories of how DNA and revealing that one's parents are not one's parents has been profoundly upsetting. I've had some wonderful discoveries through DNA. So here is another example from an Irish parish register of the 1840s of a Bridget Dwyer. I had absolutely no idea what happened to Bridget Dwyer, but through DNA, I was able to find relationships to 2 of her daughters who immigrated to the United States, and there are at least 24 descendants that come from 2 of Bridget Dwyer's daughters. In another example, a lost person on my father's side of the family were these Flynns, who are enumerated here in the 1901 Irish census. In line number 5, William Flynn actually lived with my family in Fall River, Massachusetts during the World War I years. William went to Manhattan and he disappeared. He had a son named Joseph Flynn. How do you find a Joseph Flynn in the Bronx? With great difficulty. But eventually, William Flynn, his descendant, contacted me through DNA, and we were able to establish that connection. So we sometimes have DNA puzzles. So one Vermont person that I shared DNA with was Margo Masterson of Brandon. I had no known Vermont ancestors. This took about 9 months to crack, but eventually what we discovered is Margo and I descended from the same families that immigrated from Sandwich, Massachusetts to Pomfret, Vermont. And when families intermarry, when you have cousins marrying cousins among a small defined ethnic group, they pass along more autosomal DNA than one would expect otherwise. And now you all know, thanks to 23andMe, that I have 250 Neanderthal variants. So in my time with you during this episode, I have just scratched the surface of DNA. It continues to be a puzzle and something that fascinates all of us.